Hey, what's going on, YouTube? Welcome back to my channel. I'm Kyle with Blind Koala Reviews, and today we're going to be actually getting into a review for this Isaac Asimov book, Foundation. Let's get into it. Violence is the last refuge of the incompetent. Hardin himself straightened at the sight of the figure that now filled the cubicle, a figure in a wheelchair. He alone of all those present could remember the day, decades ago, when that figure had appeared first. He had been young then, and the figure old. Since then, the figure had not aged a day, but he himself had in turn grown old. The figure stared straight ahead, hands fingering a book in its lap. "I am Hari Seldon." The voice was old and soft. He had long stopped wishing for the mild vegan tobacco of his youth. Those days when the planet Terminus had trafficked with every part of the Galactic Empire belonged in the limbo to which all good old days go, toward the same limbo where the Galactic Empire was heading. He wondered who the new emperor was, or if there was a new emperor at all, or any empire. Space. For 30 years now since the breakup of communications here at the edge of the galaxy, the whole universe of Terminus had consisted of itself in the four surrounding kingdoms. How the mighty had fallen. Kingdoms. They were prefects in the old days, all part of the same province, which in turn had been part of a sector, which in turn had been part of a quadrant, which in turn had been part of the all-embracing Galactic Empire. And now that the Empire had lost control over the further reaches of the galaxy, these little splinter groups of planets became kingdoms, with comic opera kings and nobles, and petty, meaningless wars, and a life that went on pathetically among the ruins. A civilization failing, nuclear power forgotten, science fading to mythology, until the Foundation had stepped in. The Foundation that Hari Seldon had established for just that purpose here on Terminus. But you haven't tried. You haven't tried once. First you refused to admit that there was a menace at all. Then you repose an absolutely blind faith in the Emperor. Now you've shifted it to Hari Seldon. Throughout you have invariably relied on authority or on the past, never on yourselves. It amounts to a diseased attitude, a conditioned reflex that shunts aside the independence of your minds whenever it is a question of opposing authority. There seems no doubt ever in your minds that the Emperor is more powerful than you are, or Hari Seldon wiser. And that's wrong, don't you see? And you men in half of Terminus as well are just as bad. We sit here, considering the encyclopedia, the all-in-all. We consider the greatest end of science is the classification of past data. It is important, but is there no further work to be done? We're receding and forgetting. Don't you see? Here in the periphery, they've lost nuclear power. In Gamma Andromeda, a power plant has undergone meltdown because of poor repairs. And the Chancellor of the Empire complains that nuclear technicians are scarce. And the solution? To train new ones? Never. Instead, they're to restrict nuclear power. Don't you see? It's galaxy-wide. It's a worship of the past. It's a deterioration, a stagnation. So like all the reviews I do on my channel, I like to give a little bit of an introduction to, my history with the genre or maybe the author or series. So with this one, the reason why I picked Foundation to read is because I actually haven't read sci-fi fiction that much, or really at all. I've only ever really read fantasy books, and so I was like, I like sci-fi movies, and I was like, let me pick up some of the, classics in the sci-fi genre, and give those a spin and see how I like them. And whenever I would go on, forums or videos looking for great, classic sci-fi books to read, and like where to start at, one that constantly is recommended is Foundation by Isaac Asimov. And from what I can tell from my research before I actually read the book, I didn't want to do too much research to find out too much about the story or anything like that. But it seems like the reason why a lot of people recommend it is because it's one of the first sort of like modern sci-fi stories. It was written in the 1940s over a few years, because the book itself is split up into 5 chapters, and those 5 chapters were released over a period of years by Isaac Asimov, I believe in like magazines or things like that, and then after they were all released, they were combined into one publication, which is now known as Foundation. And from what I was reading, it seems like Asimov's work has a ton of influence on, sci-fi going forward. But after doing the little research I did online about the series and the author and whatnot, and seeing that the page count to the book is actually pretty low compared to a lot of other ones like, Dune and, books like that where it's, 500, 600 pages. Foundation is only around 250 pages, so it's actually quite shorter than most sci-fi and definitely fantasy books. And with all those factors adding up, I decided that this would be a great place for me to start my sci-fi literature journey. So that's about everything I wanted to say in the introduction. Let's get into the actual review of the book. Before I get into the actual characters and some of the plot elements of the story, I wanted to just give some of my overall takeaways from the story, some of the themes that they discussed and whatnot. And I think the best place to start with this is just how this book was much different than what I was expecting. It's much more political. It focuses a lot more on the political connections, the characters, and sort of how they maneuver behind the scenes in political ways and with their political power, and how these people who have access to power use it to further their own goals or to further goals of the Foundation. But overall, it's a lot different from what I expected, because I was expecting more, just standard sci-fi, like, space battles, with laser pistols and, things like that. But it was actually much more politically based and sort of focused around how empires rise and fall, the process of an empire rising to power, and how it, loses its power and continues to deteriorate, and, the sort of conditions that lead to that. So in that aspect, the book actually reminded me a lot of Game of Thrones in terms of how much, politicking and how much like behind closed doors and sort of that sort of stuff, and the trickery that we see the characters use to advance their aims, and all that sort of stuff combined. It gave me a much more sort of political, and really just reminded me of Game of Thrones a whole lot. Now, obviously, that wasn't intentional, since Game of Thrones was released in the late 90s, early 2000s, and this was released in the 40s, so Foundation is quite ahead of Game of Thrones' time. But I'm wondering if George R. R. Martin ever did take any inspiration, from Foundation or books similar to that, where a lot of the focus is on the politics, and a lot of battles and things like that sort of happen off screen or off page, like you just hear about the results of it. Not necessarily like the page by page description of, how the battle goes on. Another very important aspect of the book, and sort of just human life in general, is religion, and how religion plays a role in the empire or empires in the story, and how with politics, how the people in power use religion to control the population, how they use it to, advance certain political agendas if they are trying to go to war with certain nations. You see how religion can be used for both good and bad things, depending on who's in power and how they want to use it. And we'll get into this more into the actual story bit, but due to how the story in the book takes place over, hundreds of years, we also get to see and examine how religion sort of can start from nothing to become something. So overall, a really strong focus on politics, religion, empire, sort of nation building, and overall, just like I said, I wasn't really expecting that going into this. I was expecting much more just standard, space battles and that sort of thing. But I was actually pleasantly surprised with all the politics and, all the behind-the-scene plays and backstabbings and things like that. I really enjoy stories that have good politics and power plays and, all that sort of trickery and treachery going on behind the scenes. Those are sort of all the big themes and big takeaways that I got from the book. So I think it'd be a good idea now to actually get into the story of the book and the characters. And this is actually going to be a little different from my other reviews, because I like to split up, the story portion and the characters portion differently. But this book's a little different in how it tells its story, in that there are probably like 3 characters, and really only 2 that you spend time with, who are, the same characters that you actually get to know background info on. Other than that, the story itself is actually, the characters are more the planets, the region, the empire. And this is due to the way that Asimov chooses to tell the story. He breaks up the book into 5 sections. And those 5 sections are the psychohistorians, the encyclopedists, the mayors, the traders, and the prince merchants. And each one of these sections has its own different set of characters, really setting, time period. And these different chapters all take place successfully with about 50 to 100 years of time period in between each chapter. So because of that, we get a lot of different perspectives, pretty much new characters and new cast of characters every chapter. And you don't really spend a whole lot of time with the characters in one chapter. They may be mentioned here or there in subsequent chapters, but they really aren't playing a prominent role. And so because of that, really each chapter has its own little sort of self-contained story, but they all interconnect to weave the bigger picture of the story of the Foundation, which is the planet and sort of the location that all of the book focuses on. And so starting with the first section of the book, the psychohistorians, this is sort of like the prologue of the story. This is where we meet the famous Hari Seldon, who, if you have researched or know anything about Foundation, he's one of the most important characters in the whole series, because he is the person who comes up with the idea to start the Foundation. He comes up with this sort of method called psychohistory, which incorporates all sorts of things, psychology, history, economics, all sorts of things that are combined into a formula which he uses to then predict the future of huge populaces of the empire. He uses this sort of algorithm to track how the empire will go into the future. Is it going to maintain its power? Is it going to crumble? Like, what's going to happen? With this algorithm, he discovers that the current Galactic Empire is soon going to collapse due to the size of the empire is just too big to sustain itself. There's political strife throughout the galaxy, and overall the empire is just in decline. And Hari Seldon uses this psychohistory to predict when it will fall, and then how long it will be in between when the first empire falls until another new empire rises. And this sort of algorithm and plot point is really what sort of spurns the whole story. Because of this, Hari Seldon decides that it's up to him to try to create the Foundation, which is this institution where their goal is to collect and categorize and document all of humanity and humans' knowledge in one single place, so that if the empire does eventually collapse like Hari Seldon predicts it will, the information from, just thousands of years of humanity won't be lost. And this is how the story starts to take shape, because at this point Hari Seldon is now starting to gather people, men, women, children, just a populace to take to a place where he can begin his foundation. And in the first section of the book, we learn that obviously the rulers of the empire don't really like what he has to say, because he's obviously predicting that the empire is going to be collapsing in, however many, it was a few hundred years or something. And because of this, the leaders of the Galactic Empire saw Hari Seldon and sort of his project and his work as sort of like a provocateur, like he's purposely trying to stoke fear and anger in the populace so that that the empire can't collapse. And so due to these predictions and concerns of Hari Seldon, he's arrested by the Galactic Empire, along with the first character who we meet, Gal Dornick, I think is how you pronounce it, who's a character who comes to Trantor, which is the planet at the center of the galaxy, to meet Hari Seldon, because Hari Seldon wants to recruit him for his Foundation project. And while they are talking, they are both arrested, and the Empire begins to put Seldon on trial for being, like I said, a provocateur, trying to cause destability in the Empire and whatnot. But after the trial, the Empire decides that, what Hari Seldon's trying to do actually isn't necessarily a problem, and so they continue to let him do his work, but they banish him to a planet called Terminus, which is on the periphery, the outside edges of the Galactic Empire, and that's where the Empire sort of deems it safe for Seldon to continue his project. And this section of the book ends off with Seldon confirming to Dornick that actually Seldon had planned to manipulate and trick the Empire into exiling him and his project, the Foundation, to Terminus because it is so far away from the center of the galaxy, and because of that, it's just going to be really hard for the Empire to sort of like keep tabs on Seldon and the Foundation and what they're doing out there. And that's the end of the first section of the book, and then we move into the next section, which is called the Encyclopedias, which takes place 50 years after the psychohistorians section. And so because of that, we jump forward 50 years and we pick up. The Foundation has been set up on Terminus. There's already, they've already started their work on collecting and gathering information and documenting it. And they're actually, I should have mentioned this earlier, but they're the information that they collect and document, they're putting into this Encyclopedia Galactica or Galactic's Encyclopedia. And actually, one of the cool things that Asimov does in the way that he structures the book is a lot of these chapters and sections, they either start with or end with like a little excerpt from the encyclopedia of the in-universe encyclopedia, and it sort of either sets up or it gives information about the events that happen in the story. And when we get to the last section, I think that's the best use of this sort of encyclopedia blurbs. I think the last one we see in the book is actually probably the best use of it, and we'll get to that in the later sections. But that's what they're doing on Foundation, is they're adding information to the Encyclopedia Galactica and just chugging away at it. And like I mentioned previously, there are three characters who really are sort of talked about throughout the entirety of the book. There's Hari Seldon, who's obviously like the father of the Foundation, so obviously he's going to be talked about pretty much throughout the whole book because everybody looks to him and his original works for guidance on, what they need to do, how they need to operate so that the Foundation succeeds. And then the other two are characters who we actually spend the most time with. And those two characters are named Salvor, I think that's how you pronounce it, Hardin, and Haber, the names of this are a little weird, Haber Mallow. And so Haber Mallow is a character who we'll get into a little later, but Salvor Hardin is a character who we meet in this section, the Encyclopedias, because he's one of the sort of original members of the Foundation. And when we meet Salvor Hardin, he doesn't really have a whole lot of political or legal power on the Foundation. At this time, pretty much all the power and legal authority that's present on the planet is given to a board of trustees or something like that. There's a board on the planet that sort of oversees the Foundation and determines what they do, how they do things. And we actually find out that Hardin is not the biggest fan of this board. And this is really the start of where we start to see the political plays being maneuvered and being played out in the story, because Hardin in this section of the story, we also find out that the Empire has started to crumble. It's 50 years on from the first section, and the Empire is starting to decline like Seldon predicted. And because of that, on the edge of the galaxy where the Foundation is located, there are neighboring areas that were under control of the Empire, but as the Empire's grip started to loosen, these sort of regions broke away and became their sort of independent kingdoms. And because of that, there's this whole new political and power struggle that's happening in the area all around the Foundation. And this is where we start to see Hardin take charge, and because he recognizes the danger or the potential danger that these kingdoms can play due to them wanting to expand their power, and also due to the fact that the Foundation and Terminus, the planet itself, are relatively small. There's not a whole lot there except for some very specific technologies, specifically nuclear technology, and then just knowledge in general. And because of that, it makes Terminus and the Foundation itself a really juicy target for these other kingdoms to try to capture and control. And we start to see how Hardin uses his political power to negotiate treaties and trade agreements
with these surrounding kingdoms for technology and knowledge that they don't have, but the Foundation has, to create sort of a peaceful situation out on the periphery of the galaxy, because the Empire, is starting to lose control and eventually will lose all control, and therefore the Foundation and these other kingdoms are going to all have to fend for themselves. And that's pretty much all we learned in this section of the book. The other big thing that I should mention that we learn about in this part of the book are these sort of situations and events called Seldon crises, which are these very specific, narrow events that were predicted by Seldon to happen, where the choices are incredibly tough for the people who have to make it, but depending on the choice they make, it will either lead to the successful, sort of burgeoning empire that the Foundation is becoming, or it will lead to the collapse of the Foundation and basically ruin. And with these sort of Seldon crises, we also learn that when they're successfully navigated and the Foundation has done the right sort of political moves and whatnot to navigate out of these scenarios, there's actually a area on the Foundation, on Terminus, where Seldon has recorded messages that are pre-programmed to play after each of these crises is crossed, and he sort of gives a little bit of information and just knowledge to the people there going forward of what they need to do. And that's pretty much everything that happens in that section, in that little chapter or section of the book. And so then we move on to the next section, which is called The Mayors, which takes place 30 years after the previous section. So we're 80 years now removed from the initial Hari Seldon, Gal Dornick sort of meeting and conversation. And this is the first section of the book where we actually get some recurring characters, because since it's only 30 years after the last section, the characters from the last one are still alive, obviously much older, but still have Salvor Hardin as he's now the mayor of Terminus, which he successfully maneuvered into and removing the board, from political power. So now the mayor, Hardin, is, the one who has control over the Foundation and sort of the legal authority. And this is now at the point in the story where the Foundation actually is starting to have its own little political battles and, jockeying of different people in positions of power to, higher positions of power. And this is shown by there's another political party who opposes Hardin and wants to be a much more active party, like take an active role against the different kingdoms surrounding them. They want to be more active in trading with these or potentially fighting with the kingdoms, whereas Hardin is much more laid back. He doesn't want to fight with any of these other kingdoms and things like that, and because of it, this other political party pops up to oppose him. And the really interesting thing about this section that I really enjoyed is this is the start where we really start to see the beginning of what Asimov does with the religion in this book. We start to see sort of a new religion form, whereas there was an old religion from the old empire, but this new one's that's starting to form on the Foundation is much more scientific based. It's not based in tradition or the normal religious values that we that we know in our world today. It's much more based on rationality, science, natural law, all that sort of stuff. But we do start to see that this new sort of ideology that these people have sort of starts to turn into its own form of religion, and they refer to it as scientism. And so it's interesting to see that, even though, these people really base their society on science, rational thinking, and all that sort of stuff, they can still have some religious dogma seep into their beliefs and ideology, and eventually start to morph that ideology into something that's more similar to more traditional religions. And with this new sort of burgeoning religion coming about, there's actually a priesthood that develops around it. And with that, like other religions, it starts to become a little bit less rational, a little bit less based on science and rational thinking, and it starts to become more mystic. It's more mysticism based and more related to the older past religions. And one of the funny things that I found in this section related to all this religion and religious section of the book is that Asimov starts to show how it is becoming more religious-like, because Hari Seldon starts to become more mystic. He's becoming more of a religious figure that people worship. And this is shown in many different ways, but one of the most prominent ones is people don't say, people say like, oh my God, or by God, look what's happening. They don't say that anymore. They say by Seldon. They've replaced God with Seldon because he's basically a god to the Foundation people in terms of his ability to use psychohistory to predict everything that he did and to have the foresight to set up everything that he did and to plan out the Foundation and all that. He begins to be viewed much more in a religious, godlike sense than just a normal human who bases his theories and ideology on science and rational thinking. And then we end off this section of the book with another Seldon crisis being successfully maneuvered through, and the hologram that follows has Seldon telling Hardin and the other people present that going forward, they're going to have to think of a solution. Seldon isn't going to give it to them, but they're going to have to think of a solution of a way to control the expanding populace, because ever since the Foundation was set up, the population continues to grow and continues to, expand across different areas of the periphery of the galaxy. And Seldon recognizes that the way of rational thinking and science and that sort of stuff isn't going to be sufficient to control and to keep calm the populace that the Foundation is soon going to be having to look after. So this is the first sort of indication we get where Seldon himself is sort of indicating that there needs to be a religion that is formed so that the populace can put their belief, their faith, their trust in the religion, because the science and the psychohistory and the psychology, all that stuff, the normal populace doesn't understand it. They're not educated in it. So they can't, it doesn't really make sense to them. So the only way they can really view it is in a religious, mystical sense. And that moves us on to our next section of the book, which is a whole new set of characters. We don't keep any of the characters from the previous two, because this next section, The Traitors, takes place 75 years after the previous section. So now we're almost 200 years removed from the initial Seldon-Dornick conversation, and at this point, the Foundation has become even more powerful. Its control of the regions around Terminus is becoming stronger, and it's starting to, branch out and send traitors, like the section indicates, the traitors, to these other regions to trade technology, religion, really anything that will allow the Foundation to get a foothold in these regions and eventually convert, the populations there to the Foundation religion and to become a member of the Foundation, which at this point is clear that it's starting to become its own it's going to become the Second Empire that succeeds from the first Galactic Empire that Seldon predicted would fall apart. And so because the Foundation is starting to expand its boundaries and its control over the region, this is where we actually start to see pushback against the Foundation and its religion from other planets who just don't want to become a part of the Foundation. They don't want to convert to their religion. Some planets, we find out, they just don't want to use nuclear technology. They don't want to use the technology of the Foundation, because at this point, the Foundation is really the only place in the galaxy that they know of that has nuclear technology. The knowledge behind it and how to work these sort of technologies has been lost across many planets and regions of the galaxy, and the Foundation is one of the few, if only, places that still has knowledge of how to operate these sort of technologies and how to repair them if they get broken. And this actually comes into play with how the Foundation and the traitors and the people who are trying to go out and expand the Foundation's control, we get to see how they use these technologies and how their knowledge of them is helpful, because when they go to these other planets and they give them these technologies, they don't have the staff or the populace or the education necessary to repair or run or operate these technologies without help from the Foundation, without help from the priesthood, all that sort of stuff. So it further shows how the Foundation will sort of coax these other regions and planets into joining them by offering them these technologies and things that they don't have that are wonderful, but then they sort of are stuck relying on the Foundation, because once they get these technologies in, they don't want to go back to not using them, but they need people who know how to fix them, repair them, or operate them, and that's what the Foundation provides. And all of this sort of sets up the story that takes place in this section of the Traders, where we learn about this planet called Ascanone, I think, however you pronounce it, where they have banned trade with the Foundation. They don't use nuclear technology, and because of that, there was actually a Foundation agent, I'm not sure if it was a priest or just a member of the Foundation, who went to this planet, who was trying to negotiate a deal with them to, trade technologies and the sort with the Foundation, so they just have another trading partner. But since this planet, doesn't want anything to do with it, they arrest this agent named Gorov, and they sentence him to execution. And because of that, the Foundation, obviously doesn't want that to happen, so they send out a trader named Ponietz, who his job is to go to this planet and to basically secure the release of this person. And once Poniet gets to Ascon, this is where, like I mentioned at the beginning of the review, we really get to see how people in power and then people with certain technologies that other people don't have will use that to sort of coax, influence, and force, in some cases, other people to join to their side. And so in this instance, what Poniet does is he takes this food chamber thing, and he jerry rigs it with nuclear energy and different things to a point to where it basically can turn things into gold. And he basically shows this technology to the leaders of this planet Ascon, and basically offers it to them as like a gift, like, you can have this, but we just want you to release, our agent. And while some of the leaders of this planet, they just brush him off, they don't want anything to do with the Foundation, there's some of the leaders on this planet who want to gain more political power, unsurprisingly, decide to meet with Ponietz to take him up on the offer so that they can use this technology without, other people on the planet knowing, to eventually gain more control over the planet of Ascon. And there's one particular leading member of the planet who meets with Poniet, gives the transmuter that turns things into gold. He gives it to him, and he gives other technologies to him for him to use to benefit his power plays, but with the full knowledge, knowing that these sorts of technologies aren't going to be able to be operated unless they, have regular servicing, they know how to repair them. And obviously Poniet's goal is that eventually this person will become so accustomed to using these technologies that not using them will be out of the question. So because of that, they're going to have to eventually ally with the Foundation and their priesthood so that they can continue to operate these new nuclear technologies that they acquired. And with that, we move into the final section of the book called The Merchant Princes. This doesn't give an exact number of years after the last one. It just says after several years. So this takes place, once again, more years after the previous chapter. And this section of the book is actually the longest. The previous sections had maybe like anywhere from like 6 to 9 chapters, whereas this section of the book has like 15 or 18 chapters. And so it's quite longer than the other sections of the book. And because of that, we meet with the second character, along with, how I mentioned earlier, Salvor Hardin. The other character who we spend a lot of time with, is named Hober Mallow. With this section of the book, the Foundation has just grown even bigger and stronger, and the religion has become even more so just standard traditional religion, and less based on, like I said in the previous sections, that was starting to be shown, is that it's becoming less based on science and psychology and the works of Hari Seldon, and is becoming more mystic, and the population is understanding less about the sort of religion and the Foundation and its purposes, and it's becoming more of a godlike sort of religious figure. So in turn, with being introduced to Mallow, we learned that he is a master trader. These people are called merchant princes, and they go around to all sorts of areas of the galaxy, trading nuclear technology, gadgets and trinkets to different nations to gain favor with them, to get things that they need back. And we see that Mallow is really good at this. He actually believes that trade and economy and sort of trade agreements between different kingdoms with the Foundation is the key to spreading the Foundation's power and its religion, which was different from the philosophy of Hardin. And we see this because the sort of technologies and gadgets that Mallow trades with other nations, they're not technologies that are useful in waging war. He's not going out and giving like space lasers and gravity shields and all these other sort of warlike technologies to these other nations. He's instead giving sort of technologies and things that increase the quality of life for the people. Small things that just make living easier. And with that, it, like in the previous section, it causes these nations and people to rely on these technologies, and the thought of the technologies going away and not using them anymore is so severe that these nations are then forced to try to maintain use and sort of trade agreements with other nations so that they can continue to use these technologies, because if they don't, then the populace is just going to have an upheaval and revolt against the rulers. So I really liked how Mallow sort of, he takes this approach to building ties with other nations instead of making them fearful or making them submit through just sheer power. He actually tricks them and gets them on their side by offering them stuff that will help them in the future, and because of it, they are just more likely to be welcoming to the Foundation and future trade agreements with them. And continuing on like the other sections of the book, the religion has just become more traditional. It's become much more immovable in terms of the traditions that the religion upholds and what they want out of their populace and people to believe. And because of that, we see that the leaders of the Foundation and Terminus no longer have as strong of a grasp on, sort of the religion and the populace, because it's become much more sort of just widespread. It's just it's much harder to control than it was previously, when the scope and how much control the religion had over the Foundation and surrounding planets was much smaller than it is now, where now the Foundation and its religion and ideology are starting to become a second empire to the previous one. And because of that, the population's drastically increasing, and the nature of the scientism, the religion that they follow, as such, becomes much more traditional in a sense. Another interesting aspect of this section of the book was that we get to have some dialogue and conversation about what is required to get a populace to move in a certain direction, and what sort of societal, political, and sort of religious prerequisites there are to get a population to do something that the leaders want, whether that's to, wage war with another nation, whether that's to try to convince the populace of a certain position, or whatever people in positions of power want for the lower populace. There needs to be some sort of like sense of patriotism or danger or something external that the populace realizes is potentially a threat to them, to give them the motivation to do something about it. And these sort of aspects to the story, to this section of the book, are really important because in this section of the book, a main portion of it, a main sort of the driving force behind this section of the book, is there's another kingdom called Corel, which wants to wage war against the Foundation, and they're like prepping battleships to go to the Foundation to fight them and all this sort of stuff. And it's up to Mallow, or not up to him, but he's someone who attempts to solve this crisis. By the end of the section, it's clear that Mallow devised a plan that does successfully navigate the Foundation and their sort of empire out of war with the Corel Empire. And this goes back to what I was mentioning in the beginning of the review with the sort of little blurbs from the Encyclopedia Galactica, because how the book ends and how I really liked how Asimov utilized this aspect of it was we, at the end of the book, we learn what Mallow's plan is, what his plan is to try to combat Corel, to stop them from attacking them. And then it ends, and the last part of the book is a little blurb from the encyclopedia, basically mentioning after 3 years of what Mallow had planned, the Corel Empire successfully, or that the Foundation successfully defeated the Corel Empire, and that it was no longer a threat to them. So we don't actually get to see if Mallow's plan works. We just read from the encyclopedia that the people on the Foundation documented that it did end up working. And because of that, Mallow became sort of this not quite like godlike figure, but he became really popular with the populace of the Foundation. And they mention how he becomes revered by the population in the same light as Salvor Hardin and Hari Seldon, two people who previously were incredibly important to the Foundation and the Foundation's success. And that last blurb from the encyclopedia is the end of the story. And obviously there's a lot left open for, the sequels that I know he wrote after that. So I'm sure we'll get more into, the furthering of the Foundation and it potentially becoming the, just the next second empire, because at this point, while it isn't a full empire, it's, it's on its way to becoming the next empire. But overall, I really enjoyed this book. Like I said, I was really surprised with how political and how the story was much more focused on, populations, how rulers control populations, how rulers use their political power to backstab one another to get into higher positions of power, how they use technology and religion to influence their own population or other populations that people are trying to conquer, and how there are different tactics about that. You can go about like with peaceful trade and negotiations like that, or you can just do straight up war, and the benefits and cons to each of those sort of approaches, and how they affect the population and how they affect the Foundation going forward. But overall, I really enjoyed that the book focused a lot on the politics, the religion, sort of the civilizations that these people live in over, just straight up spaceship battles and things like that. I thought it was a much different approach to sci-fi media that I have consumed in the past. I guess I can end this review off by saying I'm definitely excited going forward to read the sequels to this book. I'll probably read maybe some of the preludes as well, because Asimov later on wrote preludes to this, and I actually believe some of the prelude stories are what is going to be covered in the upcoming Apple TV Plus series Foundation. And so I'll probably be watching the show before I read those books, but I'm definitely excited to learn, just more about this universe, learn more about the stories that happen after this first book. And I would definitely recommend it to anybody who hasn't read it. Like I said, it's a pretty short book. It's only 250 pages. I'm a little bit of a slower reader, so if you're a faster reader, you could probably get that done in, a week or something. But yeah, I'm really looking forward to the Apple TV series, and I'm definitely looking forward to the sequel books. So I'll probably be doing some reviews for those when I eventually complete them, and I'll maybe even do some videos on the Apple series. But anyways, guys, I hope you enjoyed my review of Foundation by Isaac Asimov. My name's Kyle. I'm with Blind Koala Reviews, and until next video, later.